Hey everyone, Bruce Eckfeldt here. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Make sure that you subscribe and turn on notifications so we can let you know when the next video is posted. You can also check us out at eckfeldt.com for more great content. With that, let's go check out the video.
You're listening to Thinking Outside the Bud, where we speak with entrepreneurs, investors, thought leaders, researchers, advocates, and policymakers who are finding new and exciting ways for cannabis to positively impact business, society, and culture. And now, here is your host, business coach, Bruce Eckfeldt.
Welcome, everyone. This is Thinking Outside the Bud. I'm Bruce Eckfeldt. I'm your host. Today we are with Adam Miller, and Adam is founder of Budding Tech and is a board member of the Medical Cannabis Council of Australia. He's also on the advisory board to the Global Cannabis Applications Corp, which is a global leader in the development of innovative data technologies for the cannabis industry. So welcome, Adam.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm really excited about this conversation, because I think that, so I'm based in New York. We're all excited about what's happening in New Jersey and in New York State and some of the East Coast here. But I actually think some of the bigger and probably more interesting aspects of the cannabis market is actually international. So, I'm really excited to kind of hear what's going on in Australia, what you're doing down there, how that's kind of feeding into more of the global market for cannabis, and how we're really treating this as an international market rather than just kind of this, local, state by state, country by country kind of thing. So excited to have you on. Thanks for being here.
It's good to be here.
Why don't we start with just a little bit of background? So I'm always curious about people's stories about how they kind of got into the space, what was the situation, but give our listeners a sense of how you got into the cannabis market.
So I had a few interesting intersection points. The first was in 2014. I so happened to meet Governor Hickenlooper in Colorado. I actually shook his hand at an event that he was running to raise funds for his campaign for re-election. 2015, I found myself in California, and I was looking around, and I thought this was a very interesting space that was evolving, but didn't really pay too much attention to it because the way that the system was set up, it was so far from what I could conceive that Australia would adopt that was just another amazing thing that the Americans had figured out how to do. And then I started to read a little bit more about the medical application of cannabis, the innovation that was taking place in America and Canada and Israel. And my eyes really opened up. And I will never forget, I was in my parents' front yard. I was visiting from out of town. And I had read an article about a startup in America called Ease Applications. And had an insight moment that the cannabis market would hit the Australian shores quite soon. And sure enough, that happened about 6 to 8 months later. The Australian government federally legalized cannabis for medical use. So I found myself involved in the space really by somewhat dumb luck. But I'm very interested in the medical application of cannabis. I truly believe that it is quite a profound medicine. And I also I have a personal family member who is in need of this medication.
Yep.
And the accessibility of it is just not here right now. So for people who are very dear and close to me, I truly hope that in the near future, cannabis in Australia will become more accessible, as I see it's in deep importance.
Yeah. And where is Australia at this point? So you say that it's they've passed legislation to make it federally legal for medical use. Give us some more insight on where the market's actually developed, what is available, what's not available at this point.
Yep. So I'll give you a bit of the background. So in February 2016, the federal government amended the Drugs Narcotics Act. That's the legislation around narcotics drugs. Mm-hmm. And the amendment was specific around the cultivation and manufacturing of cannabis for scientific and medical purposes. So scientific being it can be grown for botanical research, and medical use is the use that patients get from the plant, as well as clinical research. So this was the first step. The second step was in October 2016 when the federal government rescheduled cannabis from Schedule 9, which is the equivalent of a Schedule 1 in America, to Schedule 8. So moving it from a prohibited substance to a controlled substance.
Got it.
And over the last 2 years, the cannabis industry has very slowly started to grow. Now, although cannabis is federally legal, the system is very different to how it's set up in America.
Yeah.
It's a very, very pharmaceutical focused model. So products need to demonstrate a safety and efficacy profile, and there needs to be quality data that has been gathered to ensure that what the patient is getting is not only high quality, consistent product, but it works across different patient groups. And because there are very limited products with that type of profile, only 600 patients in the last 2 years have actually been granted federal approval to use cannabis. And if you look at the German market, for example, in Germany, the medical market established at a close proximity to the Australian market. And in the first year, about 13,000 patients gained access to some sort of medical cannabis product. So there's a big discrepancy there.
What drove the discrepancy?
Well, the main factors are the quality control products.
Okay.
Australians are very conservative people, much more different to the American and Canadian population. Mm-hmm. Australians are conservative. They go by the books, and they pay a great deal of respect to the medical authorities and the regulators. So although cannabis is federally available, it's not endorsed by the Australian Medical Association and the Royal College of Physicians. Mm-hmm. And there's not an open support from the federal government. Although there is a lot of public displays of support, actions speak much louder than words. And 600 patients is a dismal amount in my professional view.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's kind of these two threads going. One is the kind of the regulatory, scientific, operational, industry side. And then there's kind of the public perception, the endorsement, the kind of the stance on cannabis as a medical tool that's still being developed. So where do you think this is going? What's the time frame for some of these things? Do you see anything that's coming down the pike that's going to change the situation?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, in the last few months, the federal government announced and legislated export. So that was announced in January, and the amendments were changed a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. So in Australia, you can now legally export cannabis products. There are some minor caveats around that, but technically it works. Mm-hmm. So the industry has been enabled. The challenge is the patient population. In order to get a license in Australia, you need to demonstrate your supply chain. So when you're applying for a cultivation or a manufacturing license, you need to be able to not only explain who the end user is, but you also need to ensure that every single relationship that equals or gets to the end user is met. So a cultivator needs to have a relationship with a manufacturer needs to have a relationship with the distribution networks, etc. Now,
so you actually have to show a complete supply chain from production, from grow to actual putting it into the hands of a patient who is prescribed that particular product. Interesting.
Correct. And you need to be able to have those relationships in place before applying for a license, which is even more tricky. So for the first year or so, there was a scramble in the industry for people to form these relationships. Mm-hmm. Now it's a little easier because the industry's developed, but initially it was quite challenging, and it still is. But the biggest challenge is demonstrate who your patient population is. Although there is a body of evidence that supports the use of cannabis for various patient populations, Australians really love those clinical trials and the end-to-end trials. So, it's all well and good to say that we're producing a medicine for patients, but you need the data to support that. Yeah. So the market growth is limited, as I said before, 600 patients, and that's really because there's not enough fully fledged clinical trial data points that are available. And anecdotal data just does not do. Yeah. And the medical communities don't endorse the GPs in Australia to prescribe cannabis. And if they do, there are some rigorous approval processes both at the state and federal level. So it's really, there's not only jumping through hoops, it's jumping through hoops with flames around those hoops.
Under tanks of sharks.
with and blood in the water.
Yeah.
So it's challenging. But again, it's the beginning of something, and it will change over time. I anticipate in about 2 years it will be much more accessible. Yeah. And I really think that the government's looking to introduce a local supply chain with a quality product that is consistent yield after yield. And once they've got those quality control measures in place, I anticipate then the market will open up because as it stands right now, the political pressure is quite significant, and patients are just getting fed up. That's the truth of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how you're kind of playing in this space now. Tell us about Budding Tech and some of the work that you're doing. Where are you trying to move the needle in terms of this market?
Thanks for asking that question.
Yeah.
Budding Tech, we've got a few. The initial vision of Budding Tech was to develop a medical cannabis accelerator. So you guys have got Gateway and Canopy Group. We're building a model for medical cannabis and hemp here in Australia. So that's one aspect of our business. Just by virtue of the fact that we've been doing this for about 3 years now, we also have a consultancy and service arm. So we help companies apply for licenses. We assist them with forming an Australian developed strategy and implementing that strategy. As well as that, we help them connect into a network. So
Got it.
We find ourselves across the supply chain, building relationships, managing projects, applying for licenses, and on the opposite end, really supporting a startup ecosystem to evolve. As well as that, I also founded the Medical Cannabis Council in 2017. It's the country's first official cannabis association. We're a not-for-profit, and we've just passed over the 70 member mark. So I'm really impressed with the work that we've been able to achieve in less than a year. It's been a tremendous journey, but there was a lot of fragmentation across the supply chain. A lot of different groups with very similar intentions. No one was communicating. Yeah. So the council's core objective was to unify the voice of the industry and to create one single front so that we could communicate and then collaborate and get our message across to government consistently with very little variance in that messaging.
Great. And tell us a little bit about the business landscape there from a cannabis point of view. Like what companies are in place? What's been happening? Is there a lot of investment, a lot of startups kind of in this space, or are things? And is it a slow simmer, or are we into a boil like we are here in the States?
It depends on where you're looking. I mean, in the last 2 years, about 20 companies have IPO'd in Australia, mostly internationals coming into Australia doing reverse listings. But there's a very sophisticated investor network that has an eye on cannabis here in Australia. So companies tend to gravitate towards that strategy. A large amount of startup capital is required to set up operations here in Oz. And also, you've got to remember that we're very close to China. So, and we also have a reputation for in China for having high grade products. So Australian products in China are well received. So people are adopting a long-term strategy approach to the Asia-Pacific market. So the kind of companies that you're seeing birthed out of Australia are primarily cultivation and manufacturing companies, pharmaceutical-style businesses that are developing cannabis therapies for patient populations. The startup activity is somewhat minimal. You're not seeing many ancillary service providers setting up in this marketplace. Limited tech opportunities. Not to say that there won't be any. We are encouraging that project to evolve. But right now, given the way the industry is developed, the infancy state that it's in, there's less traditional tech-styled startups and more pharmaceutical-styled businesses being developed here. And then there's the hemp market, which is growing quite quickly. Last year, there was a change to legislation that allowed for us to finally have hemp food products available here in Oz. I just did a lecture at a conference called the Hemp Expo, and it's definitely a space that's evolving quite quickly. So I anticipate the hemp industry is going to boom, and the cannabis industry will bud shortly thereafter.
Yeah. So, and in terms of the bringing in, trying to bring one voice to the market, what are the things you're focused on? Are there any messages or intentions that you have in terms of trying to unify or trying to communicate to government and to the rest of business what's happening in the cannabis space and what kind of support and what kind of integration it needs?
Well, we're at the beck and call of our members, so we have a very close dialogue with our members, and the agenda is set around what their objectives are. So we have a number of committees across the supply chain. These committees are solely focused on determining the agenda for education or for licensed producers or for export. Our mandate is to build an industry backed on evidence and high quality products for patients. So that mandate sits above the council to build an industry that supports the parties since the launching of our council. But primarily what the objective is to ensure that our members have a consensus, and we put that consensus to government. So an example of this was when the government had put out a request to industry to understand what the position on export was. We consulted with our members and put through a submission to address the government regarding the cannabis industry's interest in export. And that then was successfully implemented about 8 months later. I won't say that the Cannabis Council was solely responsible for that, but I definitely say we played a role in shifting that position at a government level.
Good. And I'm curious about the export piece, because I think that as much as all these local markets have growth opportunities and are doing interesting things, I think the international side, once you start looking at cannabis as an international market, it's a whole different ball of wax. What do you see happening at an international level? How do you see Australia playing into that? What do you think is going to be, what can we expect over the next 12, 24 months in terms of development of an international cannabis market?
Well, the reason the federal government opened up export is to empower the local industry to have an additional revenue model that could sustain their or to keep it viable, really. Now, I don't know if you know this, but Australia supplies about 40% of the world's poppies.
Oh, interesting. I did not know that.
So we have a reputation for producing high grade pharmaceuticals, and I believe Australia intends to leverage that. The supply shortages in Germany and potentially in Canada might be an opportunity for Australian operators to take their product from the local supply and move that internationally. In the last 2 years, more than 15 countries have created a medical program. Thailand, for example, in Asia Pacific region, has just recently announced its intentions to legislate cannabis for medical use. So as this shift in perception starts to change around the world, so too will the opportunities for product to be supplied to countries that are developing their local supply chain, just like the Australian infrastructure is developed in a similar fashion. For the first 2 years, we have had no local product, and we've been receiving most of the product from Canada and the Netherlands. So this is how Australia will, develop its international footprint.
Yeah.
As well as that, the amount of research that's being conducted in Australia is there's quite a bit. There's a number of clinical trials being developed here in Australia, and eventually the intention will be to have pharmaceutical products that have gone through past phase 3 clinical trials, and those products will then be positioned for a global market. And we have an excellent reputation for high grade pharmaceuticals, as I mentioned. So that's long game for Australia. And as cannabis is more widely adopted internationally, so too will the opportunity for those products to be shipped internationally. With that being said, we do have competitors. You look at Colombia, for example, where they've got quite liberal medical cannabis legislation and a strong intention for export. Couple that with low-cost labor and ideal growing environments, you're going to have a pretty competitive product price to contend with. So it's quite volatile right now where the market sits in regards to who's going to own it, so to speak. But at the same time, I think that the lag is quite significant. Australia has had a few years ahead of other countries, and we also have a fantastic legislative system in respect to its professionalism and its structure. So I anticipate that countries will model a similar medical system around the Australian infrastructure. I know that if you look at Israel, they're going through a legislative reform right now. So they're trying to the industry's grown in Israel over the last 10 years or so. And now they're trying to introduce legislation and regulations around the quality control and the systems in place to ensure that patients are getting a consistent product and it's distributed through a measured system. Australia already has that built in from day one. So our infrastructure, although it's restrictive, it will be highly effective in the next 5 years or so. So there's opportunities, and it's hard to say which ones are going to be the most practical, but I really believe that the train has left the station, and it's only a matter of time before cannabis at a global scale is implemented. It's really quite exciting to see. After Australia, again, about 15 countries have followed in pursuit. So it's just a cascade effect now.
Yeah. I do think for Australia, the international market is the bigger play. I mean, is that where you think the big money is going to be in a couple of years?
I think the big money will be China.
Yeah. Supplying China.
Yeah, I do. And we have very strong trade relationships with China. So I imagine that will be leveraged in due course. But the local market's the most important to focus on for us. There are 20 So the population of Australia is about 26 million.
Mm-hmm.
The pain population in Australia sits between 3.5 to 5 million people, and about 73% of the pain population are prescribed some sort of opiate.
Yeah.
And it's 58% of that is effective. So there's a massive gap of patients that aren't receiving medicines that are actually working.
Several million people there that could benefit from a good, high quality medical marijuana product. Yeah.
Yep, and that's only for one. That's just for pain.
Yeah.
There's other patient groups that are going to also need this medicine that are severely affected. So I think the local market will be strong enough to support the companies here, but it's very hard to say where the industry is going to go, because it depends if there's a pharmaceutical approach that's adopted, if there's a medical approach doctor, or if it's a recreational approach. All of them will have very different market focuses. So Australia, as I said, there's a much stronger focus on pharmaceutical grade cannabis. So for any country that's looking to implement a pharmaceutical model, Australia will be an ideal hub for a product.
Yeah.
But you look over at Canada, the system's much more medical and less pharmaceutical focus, and it's the accessibility is more, it's quite evident. Patient population grew last year by more than 227%. So there's a significant uptake, but it's because it's not as regulated as Australia.
Yeah, it does seem like there's this whole kind of game right now between level of regulation, adoption, development of the industry. We'll see which curve crosses which curve in the next couple of years, but it is. I've seen the sort of big differences in that. Even here in the U.S. on a state by state basis, it's really affecting how the market's developing.
Yeah, and the fact that it's federally illegal makes it even more interesting.
Yes, exactly. It's all these little supply chains on a state by state basis. We'll see what happens if we actually get it.
And it's disappointing. I think America's losing out on a significant opportunity. I mean, the amount of IP or the amount of knowledge in America that exists it's incredible. You look at some of the genetics that have been developed in America over the last decade. It's unfortunate to see that locked away for another few years. I truly hope that the country gets its act together and some of that knowledge can be shipped internationally, because it would be very well utilized, especially in a country like Australia where we're trying to do rigorous research and understand really how this product works. And then even looking at, the characterization of the entourage effect and really trying to understand how this plant works on a molecular level. The more countries that get involved in a project like this, the better it is. And this is something that we're working on with the Global Cannabis Corporation, is effectively trying to characterize the entourage effect, working with licensed producers, doctors, and patients to really understand not only what a patient gets and how it works, also ensuring that the doctor reports back so that they're there are multiple data points that are recorded, but really characterizing the chemical profile so that we can say over time, after thousands of people have used this product, that these are the active therapeutic ingredients. And then we can create targeted medicines, which is fantastic. It would be a wonderful day when we see and we truly understand how the 480 plus molecules in the cannabis plant work.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's one of the things that really makes this industry so fascinating, because you have business aspects, you have scientific aspects, you have organizational, operational, delivery, supply chain aspects. I mean, it is multiple levels of challenges, all of which the solutions to will dramatically increase, its effectiveness and the growth of the whole industry. So yeah, it is certainly a challenge that we have here in the States. It's this whole sort of state by state regulation and the kind of the walls that we put up make it difficult. It also makes opportunities. I've seen a lot of interesting businesses and a lot of business ideas out there that are finding ways to take advantage of that and finding ways to leverage it. So I'd be curious to see how things play out. Adam, this has been great. We're just about at time. I wanted to give you a chance. If people are interested in learning more about you, about Budding Tech, about the councils you sit on, about the Australian market, just in general, what's the best way to get a hold of you and learn more?
Adam@buddingtech.com is my email address. You can shoot me a line. I'll respond. Our websites, buddingtech.com and the medicalcannabiscouncil.org.au, resources there. Budding Tech has a weekly mail out that we send that provides updates about the global industry. So I highly recommend tuning into that. Fortunately, we're not so big on the social media, but that's changing in due course. So we'll stick to the websites and the email addresses for now.
Sounds good. And I'll make sure for the listeners that all of that information is in the show notes so they can click on those. Adam, this has been great. And we will keep in touch and hopefully we can do another episode sometime when the market's a little farther along.
It'll be an absolute pleasure. Thank you for the time. It was a pleasure to chat.
You've been listening to Thinking Outside the Bud with business coach Bruce Eckfeldt. To find a full list of podcast episodes, download the tools and worksheets, and access other great content, visit the website at thinkingoutsidethebud.com. And don't forget to sign up for the free newsletter at thinkingoutsidethebud.com/newsletter.